Okay, everyone, so this chapter, we're going to be still in chapter 2. We're going to be covering a few more things from chapter 2, and then we're going to take a quiz over chapter 2, or let's just say a shortened test over chapter 2 before we get into more in-depth concepts in a couple weeks from now. So what I'm going to be talking to you about today, you might have talked about it last year in IM3, is called completing the square. But we're going to be completing a square to do something called writing the equation of a circle. So I'm going to go through the equation of a circle. I'm going to go through how to complete the square with a quadratic, and then I'm going to tie everything together with completing the square for equations of a circle. So in your notes, I give you this. What I say is x minus h squared plus y minus k squared equals r squared. Now the reason why I have these three in red, because these are the three key numbers. So let me explain to you what everything is. But before I explain, whenever you graph a circle, all you need is two things. You just need a radius. So let's say I have a radius of -4 and up to, that's the location of the circle. And then let's say the center of my circle, not the radius, but the center of my circle is -4 and 3. And I'm going to give this a radius of 3 units. I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, because the radius is 1, 2, 3, and the radius is symmetrical from the center. Well, I mean, that's a pretty messed up circle, but if I have this, I know my radius is equal to 3. Now, the reason why this is important is because this h is your x number. This k is your y number, and your radius is here. So what you guys are doing is, when you're writing the equation of a circle, you're going to replace this x number for what it is, which is -4. Replace this y number with what it is, which is 3. And put your radius here. Now we're going to clean this up. So this equation of a circle is x plus 4 squared plus y minus 3 squared equals 3 squared or 9. Either they can have your radius squared or they can just have a number. And if there's a number, you square root that to figure out what the radius is. So with that said, let's see if you guys can pause the video and I give you an example question, which is x minus 4 squared plus y plus 3 squared equals 36. Let's see if you can graph that real quick. Go ahead and pause the video and try and graph it. Okay, so if you pause it and you try to graph it, I'm assuming since this is a STEM class, probably every single one of you guys got this correct. You should have understood that your radius in here was a 4 and -3, because it's always in the form of x minus whatever your x number is for your center, y minus whatever your y number is. And your radius is the square root of 36, which is 6. And then if you were to graph this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, -3, and then up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, to the right 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, over 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Anyways, your circle is going to look something like this. There's your circle. Now, this is a little more in depth when we get into more distinct equations of circles. You have to use completing the square to rewrite an equation of a circle, but I'm going to review with you from last year how to complete the square with a quadratic. And I give you the steps on how to complete the square. So normally quadratic in standard form is ax squared plus bx plus c. Now I think the way that this is set up is your A is always going to be a 1 when you complete the square, or when you completed the square last year. So I'm going to keep this relatively simple, and then we're going to get into completing the square when your A doesn't equal 1 towards the end of this semester when we start talking about conics. So right now I'm just going to show you how to complete the square. Okay, so let's take x squared minus 3x minus 10. If I solve this, if I solve x squared minus 3x minus 10, I can factor this, right? I could say two numbers that multiply together to get negative 10, add together to get negative 3 is negative 5 and positive 2, giving me zeros of 5, 0 and negative 2, 0. Okay. Well, we use completing a square when sometimes it's too difficult to solve, meaning to factor. If you can factor, you always factor it. You could also use quadratic equation instead of completing a square, but you have to understand how to complete the square in order to set up equations of circles, which is what I'm getting at in this lesson. So if I were to ask you, solve this quadratic by completing a square. Not by factoring, because these are the roots for factoring, but we're going to complete the square so you can see it's the exact same answer. But I'm going to show you step by step. Okay, the very first step is to, in your notes, you should see it says get ax squared plus bx all by itself. That means get ax squared and bx all by itself. So I'm going to take this negative 10 and I'm going to add it to both sides. I'm going to move it over here. Okay, now my second step that I'm going to do is, this is the weird thing. This is the weird part from last year. You take half of your b, square it, and you add it to both sides. So my b is negative 3. I'm going to take half of negative 3, which is 1.5, and I'm going to square it, and I'm going to add 1.5 to both sides. You know what? Actually, I'm going to use a more simple one. I'm going to use, because I don't want to deal with decimals, since I just made that up. Let's do this. Let's say x squared minus, this will be easier, minus 4x minus 32 equals 0. So if I were to solve this, I would factor this. And I would have x minus 8, x plus 4, which is going to give me a positive 8 and a negative 4 as my root. Well, I'm going to do this process by completing the square. So in order to complete the square, move this 32 over, because you have to have the ax squared plus bx all by itself. Ax squared plus bx, this is going to be a lot more simple than the other equation, because the other equation you would have decimals and it's going to make it a little confusing when I'm explaining this. This is going to be a lot more simple. So in order to complete the square, you take half of your b. This is your a. Your coefficient a is 1. Your coefficient b is negative 4. So you're going to take half of your b. What's half of negative 4? Negative 2. You're going to look at the second thing. Take half of b, and then it says square it. So take this and square it, which is positive 4. This positive 4, notice how it says on the second last thing on step number 2, add it to both sides. So you're going to have x squared minus 4x equals 32. And you're going to add the plus 4 to both sides. The good thing about watching pre-recorded lessons is if I lost you anywhere, you can go back, you can rewind this video, go back, and then make it make sense to you. Okay, now with this, the third step, it says factor this. Factor the ax squared plus bx plus c. So I am going to have x, two numbers that multiply together to get positive 4, add together to get negative 4 is x minus 2 times x minus 2. And then I'm going to add these two to get 36. Just to give you a hint, the number that always goes back in here is always half of your b. Remember when we took half of b, it was negative 2. That's the number that always gets plugged back into there. I'm going to clean this up. Instead of saying x minus 2 twice, I'm going to say I have x minus 2 squared equals 36. Remember, this is my solution. Now, I'm doing this to solve. I'm solving for my x. Some of you guys might say, why in the heck would I ever do this much work when I can just factor it? The answer is, I don't know. You tell me. I have absolutely no idea when you would do all this work. You don't do all of this work. You would just factor it and solve it. But you have to understand how completing the square works in order for you to do the second part of this lesson, which is the more difficult part. Anyways, if I were to ask you to solve for x squared, to solve for x, to get rid of this square, remember your square root both sides, and you have x minus 2 because that square cancels out. The square root of 36 is a plus and minus 6. Add 2 to both sides to move this over. So 6 plus 2 is 8, negative 6 plus 2 is negative 4. There's your roots. Okay, what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you an example question on completing the square. I'm going to see if you can run through this relatively quickly. So once I write this question up on the board, I don't know what I'm going to write up yet, but once I write it up on the board, I want you to see if you can complete the square to solve. Don't factor it, but complete this square to solve it. So let's say x squared minus, I don't want to give you a decimal. Let's say minus 6x factor that. I'm sorry, not factor that. If you factor that, you know the answer is right off the bat. Well, let's do this. Let's do this. Let's say this isn't, let's make it like that now. Now you can't factor that. You would have to use a quadratic equation. Well, the thing is, I want you to solve this by completing a square. So pause this. Pause this. X squared minus 6x minus 1 equals 0. See if you can solve it by completing the square. Okay, so if you paused it, you should have already seen if you solved it. I'm going to go through this a little faster now. First step is get the ax squared plus bx all by itself by moving my negative 1 over to the other side. Second step is take half of my b, which is negative 6, take half of it, which is negative 3, square it, which is positive 9, and I'm going to add 9 to the left side to give me x squared minus 6x plus 9, and to the right side. All right. Now, next step is factor ax squared plus bx plus c. So what this is, two numbers up, multiply together to get positive 9, add together to get negative 6. Remember, the two numbers that always end up going here is whatever half of b was. Remember how it was negative 3? Those are the two numbers that go there. Anyways, if I clean this up, I have x minus 3 squared equals 10, because I have two of those, so I'm just going to say x minus 3 squared. Okay, next step, square root both sides. Square root, and you have x minus 3 equals, I think the square root of 10 is like plus and minus 3.1, because the square root of 9 is 3. Square root of 10 was probably 1/10 more. I don't know, I'm going to assume it's 3, let's just round and say 3.1, plus and minus 3.1. So my roots would be, if I add 3, it would be 3 plus 3.1 comma 0, and if I add 3, negative 3.1 plus 3, whatever that is, so it'd be negative 0.1 comma 0. Anyways, those are your roots. Hopefully that made sense to you. If I went a little fast somewhere, go ahead and rewind it to see if it's going to make sense. Now what I'm going to do is at the bottom of the steps, notice how number 4 it says repeat for the y's. That probably doesn't make any sense until I talk to you about circles. On the steps where it says complete the square, look at the very fourth thing. It says repeat for the y's. Because remember equations of circles. It has x minus your x number for your center plus y minus your y number for your center equals your radius squared. This is how we have to get the equation. And I'm going to walk you through step by step on, let's try the very first one. The question is x squared plus y squared plus 2x minus 4y equals 4. The question is, what's the center and what's the radius? The radius isn't 4, just to let you know. And this does not look anything like this. But we are going to complete the square twice. Once for the x's, once for the y's, to get this to look like this. And you'll see how this is done in a second. All right. Very first step you do is group the x's and the y's together. I have x squared and I have a positive 2x. And then I am going to do this, make a parenthesis plus parenthesis. I have y squared and then I have a negative 4y. And I'm making a little room because I'm going to be filling in, boop, boop, those two numbers by completing the square. Remember from a couple seconds ago, how do you complete the square? Take half of your b, which is 1, square it, which is positive 1, and add that to both sides. It's the same concept. No matter how high you go in math, the concepts are always the same. It's just the questions start to look crazy and weird and difficult, but the concepts are exactly the same. Okay. With your y, remember, how do I complete the square? Take half of your b, which is negative 2, because half of negative 4 is negative 2. Square it, which is positive 4, and add that to both sides. Let me reiterate what I did. I took half of 2, which is 1, squared, which is positive 1, added that to both sides. Half of negative 4, which is negative 2, squared, which is positive 4, and added that to both sides. Same thing as I just did a couple minutes ago, just when I had a quadratic. It's all the same thing. Okay, and then remember with the quadratic, we factored this. Two numbers that multiply together to get this number, added together to get your middle term. But I told you the shortcut, whatever half of your b was, that was the number that goes right here. Same with this, but this is y. Half of negative 4, which was negative 2, or negative 2 times negative 2 is 4, negative 2 plus negative 2 is negative 4. And then, when we completed the square, remember I said you can clean this up and say, instead of I have x plus 1 times x plus 1, I can just say I have x plus 1 twice. Oh, look at this, dude. Look. It's getting to be the same now. Plus, instead of saying I have y minus 2 times y minus 2, I have y minus 2, but I have this do twice. Look, it's getting to look like the equation of a circle now. Equals 4 plus 4 is 8 plus 1 is 9. Oh, look at this. Now, if I have this form, and I ask you, what's your center of your circle? Or if I asked you to graph this. Your center is negative 1, positive 2. Your radius is 9. So this x squared plus y squared plus 2x minus 4y equals 4 is the identical equation to this, but this is much easier to understand. I'm going to have you guys look at the very last example question. Do you see the last example question? X squared plus 2y plus 10x plus y squared equals 0. what I want you guys to do is I want you to write that as an equation of a circle, label the center of the circle and the radius. So please write this equation, x squared plus 2y plus 10x plus y squared equals 0. Find the center and the radius of that. Pause it and go ahead and give it a shot. Okay, now that you pause it and you go and hopefully you got the right answer, let's check it out. I'm going to go through this one a little faster because I'm going to assume that this is going to be our fourth one that we've done. This should be somewhat familiar to you. Now, group your x's together. X squared plus 10x. I'm going to leave a little blank space. Group your y's together. Y squared plus 2y. Leave another blank space equals 0. All right. Now, I'm going to take half of my b, which is 5, squared, which is 25, add that to both sides. But I know when I factor this now, I'm going to have x plus 5 times x plus 5, which is 2 of those, twice. If I lost you, go back and rewind to make sure it makes sense. Take half of your b, which is 1, squared, which is 1, add it to both sides, and then factor this. Y plus 1 times y plus 1, which is y plus 1. I have 2 of those. Equals 26. 0 plus 25 plus 1 is 26. Okay, now, what's your center? -5, -1. What is your radius? Boop. Whatever the square root of 26 is, which is like 5.1. Then you graph it. That's simple. So the lesson that you are doing today is a worksheet. On the notes, you have questions about how to complete the square with quadratics. Don't use a quadratic equation. See if you can do it using completing the square. And then the more in-depth ones at the very bottom of the worksheet is a couple questions like this where you have to graph this.